You don't just get lost in the Ozarks, something lets you wander far enough to be taken. Most folks who vanish here are men traveling alone, teamsters, drifters, soldiers coming home too late from wars no one remembers. They follow the same forgotten traces that wind between limestone bluffs and sinkholes so deep the locals swear they have no bottom. They camp one night beside a spring that tastes faintly of iron, hear a woman singing in the dark just beyond the firelight, and by morning their horses are trembling, their gear untouched, and the men themselves are simply gone. Not dragged away. Not murdered where they slept. Gone, as if the mountains inhaled and decided to keep them. The old people in Newton County still lower their voices when they speak of the Bell sisters, 3 women who arrived in these hills before Arkansas was even a state, who built a cabin no neighbor ever found twice in the same place, who never seemed to age and never buried their dead. Folks claimed the sisters could make a man follow them into the fog with nothing more than a tilt of the head and a smile that showed too many teeth. They said the sisters needed something only a man could give, something warmer than gold and thicker than whiskey, something that kept their skin smooth and their eyes bright long after the grave should have claimed them. For a while, the disappearances were just stories, whispers to scare children away from the deep woods. Then the stories started leaving evidence. A pocket watch stopped at midnight found ticking again in a hollow tree, boot prints that led to a cliff edge and simply stopped, though the mud was soft enough to hold the mark of a deer, a bloodless corpse discovered upright against a cedar, arms spread like he'd been nailed there by nothing but moonlight. People tried to burn the sisters out once. They say the flames rose green and smelled of lilac even in winter. They say 3 figures walked out of that fire untouched and kept walking until the trees closed behind them like a curtain. The missing never stopped. They just got quieter about it. And if you're a man driving some lonesome stretch of Highway 7 after dark, or hiking a trail the maps forgot, and you hear a woman's voice calling your name from somewhere the wind shouldn't carry sound, well, keep walking. Don't look back. Don't answer. Because whatever took those men 150 years ago is still hungry. And it knows your name now, too. October 1893, and the Buffalo River trace was little more than a scar of red mud and hoofprints threading through the Boston Mountains. Elias Crowder, 31, late of the Confederate irregulars and freshly discharged from a federal prison in Little Rock, was driving a single wagon south toward the Indian Territory with everything he owned in the world, 2 sway-backed mules, a crate of patent medicines he meant to sell to the Cherokee, and a Spencer carbine older than he was. He had no wife waiting, no kin closer than a half-sister in Memphis who'd stopped answering his letters. Solitude suited him, it always had. Dusk came early that far down in the hollows, the kind of sudden dark that swallows color and leaves only the smell of wet leaves and distant wood smoke. Elias had planned to camp at a known spring near the old saltpeter cave, but a cold rain rolled in off the ridge and the mules balked at the ford. He cursed them, cracked the reins, and pushed on another mile until he saw the faint glow of a lantern swinging in the trees ahead. 3 women stood in the trail. They wore black dresses the color of creek silt, high-necked and long-sleeved despite the damp, and their hair hung loose and shining like they just washed it in moonlight. The oldest, though none looked past 30, held the lantern high enough for Elias to see pale faces, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that caught the flame and threw it back red. The youngest smiled first. Not the polite smile of hill folk greeting a stranger, but something slow and knowing, as if she'd been expecting him for years. Their cabin sat just off the trace, half hidden by a stand of dog hobble and witch hazel. Smoke rose straight from the stone chimney despite the rain, and the smell that drifted out was not fatback or beans but something sweeter, clover, maybe, or lilac in the wrong season. The middle sister spoke with a soft lilt that belonged to no county Elias had ever ridden through. She asked if he was weary, if his animals needed shelter, if he would take coffee and cornbread before the storm worsened. Her voice settled over him like warm quilt batting. He found himself nodding before the question was finished. He never remembered unhitching the mules or carrying his saddlebags inside. He only remembered the fire burning low and blue, the way the women moved without seeming to cross the floorboards, the taste of something metallic under the sweetness of the coffee. The youngest sister sat beside him on the settle, close enough that the fabric of her sleeve brushed his wrist, and asked his name as though tasting it. When he told her, she repeated it once, soft, intimate, the way a woman might speak to a lover in the dark. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the lantern burned lower and lower, until the only light came from the hearth and the strange red glimmer in 3 pairs of unblinking eyes. Elias felt sleep pulling at him like an undertow, heavy and inevitable. The last thing he heard was the oldest sister whispering to the others in a language that hurt behind his eyes, and the soft, wet sound of the door being barred from within. 3 weeks later, on the first hard frost, a pair of trappers following the trace found Elias Crowder's wagon exactly where the trail pinched between 2 bluffs above the Buffalo River. The canvas tilt was still tied tight, the wheels sunk to the hubs in frozen mud, but the mules stood trembling in their traces, ribs showing, eyes rolled white with something worse than hunger. Both animals had worked themselves into a lather trying to bolt, the reins were chewed clean through and the leather breast straps shredded as if by teeth sharper than any horse could grow. The trappers called out Elias's name until their voices cracked. No answer came back except the wind rattling the dead hickory leaves overhead. They climbed down, rifles ready, half expecting to find a painter crouched on the wagon seat. Instead they found emptiness so complete it felt staged. The bed of the wagon was neat, crates of Dr. Kilmer's swamp root and Carter's little liver pills stacked exactly as a careful man would leave them. A tin coffee pot sat on the lowered tailgate, still holding half an inch of liquid gone to black ice. Elias's bedroll lay spread but unslept in, the blankets folded with military corners. His Spencer carbine leaned against the wheel, fully loaded, hammer wrapped in a twist of rawhide to keep it dry. Not one cartridge had been fired. Not one thing had been stolen. Only the man himself was missing, and every drop of blood that had ever coursed through him. The trappers noticed it first on the seat cushion, a dark bloom the size of a dinner plate, soaked so deep the wool was stiff. More on the ground beneath the wagon, long, deliberate splashes leading nowhere, as though someone had swung a full bucket in wide arcs and then simply walked off without leaving prints. When they lifted the crates they found the wagon bed itself painted underneath, the planks glossy and wet-looking even after weeks of rain and frost. They pried up a loose board and the smell that rolled out made both men gag, sweet copper and something floral rotting underneath. One trapper, an old Frenchman named LeBlanc, cut open a mule's flank to see if the blood was animal. It wasn't. The mules were weak from thirst and terror but otherwise untouched. Whatever had been taken had come from Elias alone, and taken so thoroughly that when the sheriff finally arrived with a posse, he swore the wagon looked like a butcher's block after the carcass had been hauled away. They found no drag marks, no struggle, no footprints except Elias's own leading from the offside wheel straight to the wagon tongue, then nothing. The earth there was smooth as a dance floor, as if the ground had closed its mouth and swallowed the rest of the story. By the spring of 1894 the disappearances had become a pattern no sheriff could ignore. 5 men gone in 7 months, all strangers passing through, all last seen on the same 20-mile stretch of the Buffalo River trace between Pruitt and Boxley Valley. A drummer from Springfield vanished with his sample case full of silk ribbons still locked. A Mormon elder riding circuit for converts left his Bible open on a stump to the Sermon on the Mount, pages fluttering like a trapped bird. A federal marshal hunting moonshiners disappeared so cleanly his bloodhound came trotting back alone 3 days later, tail tucked, refusing to recross the river. Each time the story was the same: wagon or horse found, belongings untouched, blood in quantities that should have painted the leaves for acres yet somehow confined to a perfect circle no bigger than a kitchen table. No tracks leading away. No scraps of clothing caught on briars. Just absence, sudden and absolute, as though the men had been erased by an unseen hand. The county authorities wanted it to be Indians. Cherokee had been moved west 60 years earlier, but people still blamed renegade Osage whenever something evil needed naming. A lieutenant from Fort Smith rode in with a platoon of deputies and spent 2 weeks beating the bush for signs of hostiles. They found nothing except an old woman selling sassafras root who laughed when they asked about Indians and told them the hills themselves were thirsty. Folks in Jasper started locking doors that had never known locks. Preachers thundered about the sins of wanderers and the wages thereof. Mothers dragged children inside at dusk. Travelers took the long way around through Harrison even if it added 2 days, because the shortcut through the mountains now carried a whisper: go alone after sunset and the darkness would choose you. The sheriff posted a $500 reward, dead or alive, for any man who could bring proof of what was taking the travelers. Handbills went up on every store porch and courthouse door from Yellville to Fayetteville. Volunteers rode out armed with Sharps rifles and Bibles, lantern oil and consecrated salt. They came back hollow-eyed, speaking of woman shapes seen at twilight that melted into cedar thickets when shouted at, of lantern light floating above the ground with no one carrying it, of a laughter that sounded like three voices braided together drifting down the hollows long after any human throat should have frozen. The reward money sat unclaimed. The trail stayed open. And every full moon another wagon, another horse, another circle of blood appeared where a man had been hours earlier, the earth around it cold as iron and quiet as a grave that hadn't decided whether to open yet. Silas Breedlove was 15 that summer, all elbows and freckles, sent to spend a month with his mother's people in the upper Buffalo country because his father said the boy needed toughening. The cabin he slept in belonged to Uncle Asa, a widower who kept no dog and spoke mostly to the fire. It sat on a ridge above Ponca Creek, half a day's hard ride from where the latest blood circle had been found. 3 nights after Silas arrived, the wind shifted south and carried the smell of wood smoke laced with something sweeter. Uncle Asa spat in the hearth and told the boy to stay inside after dark, then took his rifle and walked out into the moonlight without another word. Silas waited until the old man's footsteps faded, then climbed the peg ladder to the loft where a single chink between logs gave a narrow view of the yard. They came just after the dogs started whining and would not stop. 3 women crossed the footlog over the creek as if the water parted for them. Moonlight slid off their hair like oil. They wore the same black dresses Silas had heard whispered about in Jasper, high-collared and heavy, skirts barely brushing the dew without wetting. The tallest carried no lantern, yet the path ahead of her stayed bright as frost. They moved without hurry, speaking low in words that made the loft boards vibrate under Silas's bare knees. In the yard stood a man Silas did not know, broad-shouldered, city coat, hands tied behind him with what looked like his own belt. A strip of cloth gagged his mouth but his eyes were wide open, rolling white, fixed on the women as though they pulled him by invisible strings. He was not dragged, he walked. Each time the middle sister lifted a pale hand, he took another stumbling step forward until he stood in the center of the yard where Uncle Asa usually split kindling. The women formed a triangle around him. The youngest drew a circle in the dirt with the toe of her shoe, slow and perfect. Where her foot passed the ground smoked faintly, smelling of lilac and hot iron. They began to sing, no, not sing, something older, a sound that crawled inside Silas's skull and pressed against the back of his eyes. The dogs clawed at the cabin door until their paws bled, then fell silent and would not cross the threshold again. The bound man dropped to his knees. The tallest sister knelt behind him, stroked his hair once like a mother calming a child, then tilted his head back until the tendons stood out. Moonlight caught the edge of something thin and bright in her other hand. Silas saw the first cut open the throat clean as a butcher's stroke, saw the dark flood spill straight down instead of arcing, saw the women lean in together, mouths open, drinking what came as naturally as breathing. Silas slid down the ladder before the moon had shifted a hand's breadth, bare feet silent on the puncheon floor, heart hammering so hard he tasted blood in his throat. Uncle Asa's rifle still leaned by the door where the old man had left it, but the boy didn't touch it. He slipped out the back way, through the hog pen and into the laurel hell behind the cabin, thorns raking his nightshirt until the cloth hung in ribbons. He ran until the ridge broke open onto the preacher's trace and didn't stop until the first rooster crowed in Ponca. Reverend Obadiah Pike found him at dawn curled under the meetinghouse steps like a kicked hound, lips split, eyes fixed on nothing. When the boy could finally speak, the words came out in a rush that chilled every man within earshot. He told of the 3 women, the bound stranger, the circle that smoked, the way the blood fell straight and was taken like communion wine. He told how the tallest sister had looked up once, straight toward the loft chink, and smiled as though she'd felt his gaze the entire time. Pike knew the women by reputation before Silas ever spoke their name. Everyone did. The Bell sisters, Mercy, Prudence, and the youngest called only Little Sister had come to Newton County in the winter of 1836 with nothing but a mule and a cedar box said to hold their mother's bones. They built a cabin no surveyor ever found twice, paid for cornmeal and salt with Spanish silver that rang wrong on the counter, and never attended burying or baptizing. Folks said they kept to themselves out of grief. Then the first traveler disappeared, and the whispers started. 20 years before Silas was born, in the spring of 1873, that same cabin had burned to the ground on a night when every creek was frozen solid. 3 bodies were seen inside by half a dozen men with torches, 3 women standing in the heart of the fire, dresses blazing, hair untouched. When the roof fell, the screaming stopped, and by morning only ash and a blackened chimney remained. The county buried 3 charred skeletons in unmarked graves on the ridge and considered the matter closed. Yet here was the boy swearing he had seen Mercy Bell's face clear as creek ice, the same sharp cheekbones from the daguerreotype the sheriff kept locked in a drawer, the same mouth that had smiled at quiltings and funerals alike without ever warming. Pike fetched that picture from the county seat himself, held it to Silas's shaking finger, and the boy nodded so hard he blooded his nose again. Word spread faster than wildfire in August. Men who had helped carry those supposed corpses to the grave remembered now how light the pine boxes had been, how the ground refused the coffins for weeks afterward, dirt heaving like something breathing underneath. The preacher stood in the pulpit the next Sunday and spoke the names Mercy, Prudence, and Little Sister aloud for the first time in 20 years, and every dog in the churchyard began to howl. The county finally sent for John Two Horse, a half-Cherokee tracker out of Tahlequah who had followed renegades for the federal court and never once lost a trail. He arrived in Jasper on a raw November morning with nothing but a mule, a Navy Colt worn smooth as river stone, and a pouch of red cedar shavings he burned whenever the wind shifted wrong. The sheriff offered him $2 a day and the reward if he brought the killers in. Two Horse only asked for a jar of salt and a quiet place to listen to the ground. He started at Uncle Ace's yard where the dirt still carried a faint lilac stain no rain had washed away. He walked the circle the youngest sister had drawn, crouched low, and pressed his palm to the earth until frost melted under his skin. Then he followed something no white man could see, a thread of colder air that drifted north along the bluffs, past sinkholes that breathed out warmth like lungs, past cedar trees whose bark peeled away in perfect handprints. 3 days later he found the mouth of the cave. It lay behind a curtain of hanging grapevine on the north face of Cave Mountain, an opening no wider than a wagon wheel and half hidden by flood debris. Inside, the air turned thick and sweet, the way a slaughter pen smells after the carcasses are gone. Two Horse lit a twist of cedar and went in alone, boots silent on the damp limestone. The passage narrowed, then opened into a chamber tall enough for a church. Stone altars ringed the walls, 7 of them, each the height of a man's waist and hollowed like feeding troughs. The channels cut into their tops were still wet, dark, and shining. Someone had been using them recently, the blood had not yet crusted. On the floor lay scraps of cloth, a strip of city broadcloth, a Mormon necktie, the brass button from a federal marshal's coat, arranged in deliberate spirals that hurt to look at directly. Two Horse knelt and traced the carvings that covered every surface, circles within circles, eyes without pupils, a shape like a woman with too many arms and no face. He had seen marks like these once before, on a cliff above the Arkansas River where the old people said the Star Woman used to drink wanderers. When he touched one symbol his fingers came away sticky, and the cedar torch flared green for a heartbeat. Deeper in, the cave forked. One branch ended at a spring that bubbled red. The other opened into a low crawl space where the sheriff's men later found the first of the bodies. 5 men, skin parchment white, laid head to foot like cordwood, every throat opened by the same neat stroke. Their chests bore the same carved sigil Two Horse had seen on the altars, crusted black now but unmistakable. When the tracker scraped at one wound with his knife, no blood followed, the bodies had been drained so completely they rang hollow when struck. He came out at dusk carrying a single object wrapped in his bandana, a lock of hair still tied with a faded ribbon, the color of corn silk, taken from a skull that had no business being female. The sheriff asked what he'd found. Two Horse only lit another twist of cedar, watched the smoke rise straight and thin, and said the mountain was older than any grave and still hungry. December came in cold and still, the kind of cold that makes axe handles snap and creek ice sing at night. The disappearances paused, as though whatever walked the trace had taken its fill for the season. Men began to breathe again. They told themselves the evil had moved on, maybe followed the river south toward Louisiana where the ground was softer and the law thinner. Then Mercy Bell walked into Ponca at 2 in the afternoon, plain as daylight. Tom Hargrove was sweeping the porch of his trading post when she crossed the footbridge alone. No shawl against the wind, no basket on her arm, just the same black dress every tale had painted, skirts sweeping the frost without gathering a single crystal. Her hair was pinned up with a bone comb older than the county itself, and her skin carried the same poreless pallor Hargrove remembered from 20 years earlier when he was a boy trailing his father to the store. She had not aged a day. Not a line at the eyes, not a sag beneath the chin, nothing to show for 2 decades of hard winters and harder men. She laid $3 silver on the counter, Spanish milled coins, 1804, the kind that hadn't circulated since before the war, and asked for a pound of coarse salt and a paper of tenpenny nails. Her voice was soft, almost shy, the faint lilt curling around the words like smoke. Hargrove's hands shook so badly he spilled half the salt across the floorboards. When he looked up to ask her name, she was already studying him, head tilted, the way a cat studies a bird it has decided not to kill yet. Up close her eyes were wrong. Not the red of the tails, but black from edge to edge, no white, no iris, only depth that made the shop feel suddenly smaller. She smiled the same small smile Hargrove remembered from childhood, the one that had once asked his father for a twist of indigo and left the store smelling of lilac for days. She counted the nails herself, tapping each iron shank against the counter so the sound rang like distant church bells. Then she gathered the parcels in a square of undyed muslin that had never seen a dye pot, tied it with a knot that needed no teeth to hold, and turned to leave. At the door she paused, looked back once, and spoke Hargrove's given name, Thomas Daniel, though no living soul had used it since his mother died. Outside, the frost on the porch boards melted in the perfect outline of her bare feet, and the prints steamed long after she had vanished down the trace toward the river. Hargrove stood frozen until sundown, salt still scattered like grave dirt across the floor, the $3 silver warm in his fist and growing warmer, until he dropped them hissing into a bucket of well water where they spun and spun, refusing to cool. January 1895, and the ridge tops were glazed with ice that turned every cedar into black glass. 43 men, farmers, storekeepers, even Reverend Pike with his Colt Navy tucked in his coat, gathered at dawn in Ponca with torches wrapped in coal oil rags and ropes soaked in turpentine. They carried every weapon the county could muster, squirrel rifles, birding guns, a couple of old muskets from the Mexican War, and John Two-Horse Spencer that had never missed what it was pointed at. They rode single file along the frozen trace, breath pluming white, horses snorting at a scent none of the men could name, yet all of them felt crawling under their coat collars. Two-Horse led them to the place the trail simply quit, where the ground fell away into a sink that had not been there the week before. A thin column of smoke rose from its throat, straight and steady despite the wind. They dismounted, tied the horses, and went down on ropes into a hollow no map had ever acknowledged. The cabin waited at the bottom like it had grown there. Same dog-trot shape, same stone chimney, same shutterless windows staring blind. Only now the logs were green with fresh moss, as though the fire 20 years earlier had been a dream. The door stood open. Inside, the hearth burned high with no wood, flames the color of verdigris licking upward into nothing. Salt poured across the threshold in a thick white line hissed and turned black the moment the first boot crossed it. They spread out with torches raised. The front room was bare except for a spinning wheel turning slowly though no hand touched it, thread the color of dried blood winding itself onto the spool. In the loft they found 3 cedar chests lined with quilted silk, each holding a single black dress pressed flat and waiting. One chest still held warmth, as though a body had lain in it minutes earlier. Then the laughing started. It came from everywhere and nowhere, 3 voices braided so tight they sounded like one throat, rising and falling in a rhythm older than English. The flames in the hearth shot higher, green and stinking of lilac. Men stumbled backward, torches guttering. Someone fired a shotgun into the roof and brought down a shower of sparks that did not burn. They put the cabin to the fire a second time. Coal oil splashed across the puncheons, torches hurled through the windows. The flames caught instantly, roaring upward with a sound like women screaming in pleasure. Through the smoke the posse saw them, Mercy, Prudence, Little Sister, standing in the middle of the room, arms spread, dresses already burning yet flesh untouched, faces lit with something that might have been joy. They did not move to escape. They simply watched the men the way a child watches ants drown. The roof fell in a thunder of green fire and the laughter cut off clean. When the smoke cleared and the ashes cooled enough to rake, The searchers found only the stone chimney standing and a single iron nail driven through the hearthstone, still red-hot and ringing like a bell when struck. No bones, no buckles, no trace that 3 women had ever burned there at all. The years after the second burning were quiet the way a sickroom is quiet. No wagons stopped on the trace with bloodless seats, no strangers vanished between one ridge and the next. Children grew up hearing the Bell sisters spoken of like the war, something their grandfathers survived but never quite finished telling about. The hollow filled in with briars and young cedar until even the chimney stones disappeared under moss. People said the fire had finally done what the first one only pretended to do. They said the mountain had swallowed its own. Then came 1926 and the telephone men. The Bell system was stringing wire from Harrison to Marshall, and the route demanded a straight shot across the Boston Mountains. Survey crews blazed a line straight through the forgotten hollow, axes ringing where no steel had bitten since the posse rode down 31 winters earlier. On the third day the foreman's pick struck something that rang back hollow. They dug, expecting a sinkhole or an old still. Instead they uncovered a perfect circle of human skeletons laid crown to heel like the spokes of a wheel. 42 men in all, every skull turned inward toward a single lightning-scarred black oak that stood at the center. The bones were bleached white and wired together with strands of copper wire no thicker than a woman's hair. Some still wore scraps of clothing, a Confederate kepi rotted to threads, a drummer's checked vest, the brass buttons of a Federal marshal long since tarnished green. The oak itself had no leaves even though it was May, and when the foreman drove his axe into the trunk the blade came away wet and red. Sap the color of fresh liver oozed from the cut and kept oozing long after any tree should have bled itself dry. They measured the circle with a surveyor's chain, exactly 66 feet across, the same as the salt line Reverend Pike had poured around his own doorstep every new moon until the day he died. Under the oak's roots they found a flat stone carved with the same many-armed woman 2 horse had traced in the cave. Someone had kept the carving polished, it shone like it had been rubbed every season since the war. The crew boss sent a boy running for the sheriff in Jasper. By the time the man arrived with a wagon and a preacher, the wind had shifted south and carried the smell of lilac so strong it made the horses rear. The skeletons were loaded carefully, bones only, no skulls. Every skull had been removed and set upright on the rim of the circle facing the tree like worshippers waiting for a sermon that never came. When the last rib cage was lifted, the ground beneath it sighed and settled, and the oak split down the middle with a sound like a woman laughing far away. The telephone line went through anyway. The poles still stand, some of them driven straight through that circle, glass insulators glinting in the sun like eyes that never quite close. October 2023, the first hard frost in 20 years, and a 34-year-old software engineer from St. Louis named Ryan McAllister decided to thru-hike the Buffalo River Trail alone. He told his girlfriend he needed quiet to think, left his truck at the Ponca low-water bridge with a note on the dash, back in 5 days, and disappeared into the same country that had swallowed better men. He carried the usual, a Garmin in reach he never pressed, a GoPro on a chest mount running continuous, and enough arrogance to believe the stories were just stories. The memory card filled for 4 days with ordinary footage, sunrise over the bluffs, elk bugling at dusk, Ryan laughing at his own reflection in still pools, saying things like nothing but beauty out here, babe. On the 5th morning the card recorded 7 seconds that were not ordinary. The camera was pointed down trail, Ryan breathing hard on a climb, when the lens lifted by itself, not wind, not stumble, lifted, as though someone had taken the mount in invisible fingers. The view swung level to the path ahead and stopped. 3 women stood 20 feet away in a perfect line across the trail. They wore black dresses cut in a style no living woman had worn since Grover Cleveland was president, high necks, long sleeves, skirts brushing the leaf litter without disturbing it. Their hair hung loose and wet-looking though the morning was dry. The tallest, Mercy, though Ryan never knew the name, stood in the center, head tilted exactly as she had tilted it in Tom Hargrove's store in 1894. The youngest smiled the same small, patient smile she had given Elias Crowder 130 years earlier. Their eyes were pits. Not dark, not black, just absence, as if the sockets had been scooped clean and the night poured in. Ryan's breathing never changed, the microphone caught no gasp, no curse, only the soft steady pull of air through a throat that already belonged to someone else. The women did not move, did not speak. They simply looked into the lens the way they had once looked into the loft chink, into the trading post doorway, into the heart of a burning cabin, and waited. At second 6 the feed stuttered. Colors inverted, sound dropped to a single low thrum like a church organ played underwater. At second 7 the image snapped to black. The memory card was recovered 3 weeks later by searchers following buzzards. The GoPro hung from a cedar limb 15 feet off the ground, still strapped to its mount, lens pointed straight down at the trail Ryan had been walking. His pack lay open beneath it, contents untouched, sleeping bag rolled with the same military corners Elias Crowder had used. A perfect circle of blood, no more than a gallon, yet enough to soak the leaves black, surrounded the pack in a ring exactly 66 feet across. In the center, pressed into the mud by something that weighed nothing at all, were 3 bare footprints leading nowhere. Ryan McAllister has never been found. The card plays those 7 seconds on loop in the Newton County Sheriff's evidence locker, and every deputy who watches it hears, just under the thrum, the faintest braid of women's laughter that was old when Arkansas was young.